their own. And so we talk a lot about that so that they can fully understand that what they're doing has a biological, like there's functioning within the brain that's getting affected by this. Because oftentimes, they think, oh, it's just marijuana, it's a plant, it's not harmful. But then when we see, okay, but it's hard for you to watch a movie now, and it never used to be. So what is going on with that, and helping them really understand what that is and why that their brains are really malleable at this time. So we talk to them about the prefrontal cortex. We talk to them about decision making, and that putting any sort of chemical into that brain is going to have consequences. And so helping them really understand what those are in a way that gives them autonomy, not out of fear tactics, not out of scare tactics, not like this is your brain on drugs type of mentality that has never worked. And in fact has been more harmful than helpful in that way. And what we've found is that in the work that we do, it works. We're seeing a natural, we don't tell them to stop smoking, and we see a natural reduction over time in the treatment that we do.
And they eat that up. They eat up the science behind it, because many of them, if not all of them, have never been taught it that way, have never understood what tolerance is, or, the long-term effects. And, one thing I think that needs to be said and that they really understand is when Sarah and I were growing up, the THC levels were so much lower. You know what I mean? They were 10%, 20. Now these kids are smoking cannabis with 80% THC levels. And the studies have shown that chronic use at these high levels with young brains has caused a myriad of kind of ailments and mental illnesses, diseases, schizophrenia, different stuff. So we conduct post surveys after each year. And the main thing that kids say that it's changed their use is learning about what marijuana is doing to them, whether it's long term, short term, but what it's doing to their brain. And I always like to say, like, when you're born, if your brain's potential is here, and you start smoking at 14 and you're smoking every day, multiple times a day, your brain, as a developing brain, may never get to this point anymore. So when they start kind of visualizing things and understanding it, it really hits home for them.
I would have loved that science stuff when I was a teenager smoking weed. I would have loved to know what I was smoking, where it was coming from, what it was doing to me, why I liked it. But the thing about smoking when I was a teenager was it was so taboo and so not allowed to be discussed. Like, I had one friend whose parents smoked and they were cool about it. And when I was like 16, we would smoke in their backyard. I could enjoy myself, but I was never going to tell my parents that I was smoking. And if I ever got caught, I was going to be in a lot of trouble with them. But times have changed. We've got legal cannabis now. We've got parents who use cannabis to calm down instead of like having alcohol at the end of the day. Some people like to toke. So the whole culture's changed around cannabis in the 2 decades since I was a teenager. How do parents now talk to their kids about being careful about using cannabis, which is now a legal substance, since pretty soon they're going to be 21 and they're going to be able to go to these rec stores? Mswati, what would you say to a parent who wants to be able to approach this subject with their kid?
So it's funny, a lot in full disclosure, I have 2 boys at home. One's 17, one's 21. He'll be 22 in March. And the 17-year-old doesn't smoke. The 21-year-old does. And I get questions from parents, like, I just found out my daughter and her friends are smoking. Actually, a coworker emailed me this the other day. I just found out my daughter and her friends are smoking. I'm so worried. What should I do? And my advice was like, all right, well, listen, don't come down on her super hard. It's normal for adolescents to want to try things, right? When you speak to her, make sure you understand that, normalize it. It's normal that you would want to try things, in music, it's normalized, in culture today, you see it all the time. And like you said, now that it's legal, kind of that taboo is lax a little bit. Mm-hmm. So, my advice is honestly just educating the kids, and saying, listen, this is what it's going to do to your brain right now. Your brain is still developing. Once you get to a certain age, and you can be responsible and use responsibly. And that's a choice you make. That's fine. But right now, as a teenager, this is harmful for you, and it is illegal. I mean, I don't really harp on that as much because, the more you make it taboo, the more kids, especially adolescents, want to rebel. My 17-year-old, he's an athlete, and actually he's not 17 yet. He'll be 17 next month, but he's an athlete. He knows his brother smoked, and we have conversations around, his aspirations and how smoking could curb that. I've talked to both of them about what it does to the developing brain. So honestly, it's kind of like our approach with the group, don't kind of criminalize it. Don't make them feel bad for doing it. Understand that experimentation, trying things, wanting to do things is normal, and just being responsible. A lot of kids are vaping now, right? And Sarah and I have a coworker who's very passionate, a colleague, very passionate about vaping and the dangers of vaping, and educating them on that and what's that's doing to their lungs and their body. But yeah, education is the main thing.
And then also talking about it in terms of a drug of perception, I think is helpful for kids to sort of get that concept where, life is really difficult right now. Do we want to change the perception of it, or do we want to change what's actually happening? And so looking at, and we use a lot of examples in terms of like the munchies or snacks that they're eating. Like, is this really good? Or is your brain telling you that this is, Cheetos dipped in ketchup is delicious? Like, trying to look at that, changing that drug of perception or changing your life. And then finally, I think looking at just the importance of tuning into the gut. And I think what we teach our kids in the group too, is that oftentimes there's a lot of anxiety. You're going to a party, something feels off, like you're in a relationship with something feels off. And when you have a drug of perception that's shifting sort of your reality in that moment, it's hard to sort of tune into your gut intuition. And so we try to teach them that there is something to be said for recognizing your gut. And if you're clouded, you're going to put yourself in situations that maybe you otherwise wouldn't with a clear head. And so the wisdom of like tuning into themselves, that they have the answers within them internally, but that oftentimes with a mood altering substance, they're going to mask that internal wisdom and could get themselves into some situations that we've seen over the years that can be pretty dangerous.
Yeah, that's a very important point, I think. So we've discussed kind of how parents can talk to their kids about weed. What do teenagers need to know who want to experiment, who want to have reliable information, some sort of safe access? What is the best thing for a teenager to do if they're interested in experimenting with marijuana, but they want to do it in a safe way?
I would say, and not that we ever advocate, teens using marijuana, but one of the things we do in our group, obviously the teens are already using, is we encourage them to do research, right? Find out what you're smoking. What is it? Is it a sativa? Is it an indica? What are the effects of the certain marijuana that you're using? We even talk about, because now, there's so many different ways to consume cannabis. So in our group, we talk about edibles and different stuff, and not just jumping in feet first. If your friends have gummy edibles, take a half of one, take a quarter of one, see how that makes you feel before you, take a full gummy or take 2 or 3 because, your friends are giving it to you.
Totally. I would just add that for students and or youth that have not started smoking and are just curious about it, we want to push the date of onset as far out as possible. So what we've learned over research in terms of the likelihood of developing an addiction or substance use disorder down the line is attached to early onset. And so if the longer that we can delay onset, the less likely there will be to develop an addiction or substance use disorder down the line. And so we never want to encourage early onset. I think back in the day, there used to be, are we having a glass of wine with dinner, or do it in the house before, getting out to other friends, building that tolerance. But what we found is that's not accurate in terms of prevention, and that if a student isn't using and they can sort of manage, we want to delay that as long as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Also, like, listen to Sarah speak. So by far, Sarah and another one of our coworkers, I think, are like some of the greatest minds in the state when it comes to, addiction and substance use prevention. And I think that's probably why our program is so successful, because Sarah comes from that background of kind of addiction and understanding what it does. I'm in recovery myself, so I understand it from a personal standpoint and understand what dependence is, addiction is. So I think that honestly is what makes our program unique is, we have that respect for the kids. Like Sarah said, we give them that autonomy to kind of explore and figure out why I'm doing this, instead of, branding them as bad or negative. And I think, honestly, just that kind of respect and that understanding, from a clinical point, I think all those things mixed together are really why kind of our program is able to have the results that we get,
Yeah, hopefully it'll be a model for substance abuse with young people across the US. It sounds like it's just a kind of a new way of thinking about discussing this issue with young people. It sounds like things have to develop and have to change since our cannabis laws are changing, our drug laws are changing, our products, our understanding of everything is changing. Then so does our education for our youth has to change too. So I'm really glad to hear that there's programs like yours out there. I wish there was something like this when I was young. I'm really glad to hear that it's going on in our own backyard here in Boston. So thank you guys both for joining me so much. Do you have a social media somewhere that people can follow you, find out more about your organization?
Yes, the CharlestownCoalition.org is our main website. So that is the larger body of our coalition work. And then the Turn It Around youth group is at Turn It Around CTN is our handle for Instagram and Twitter and Facebook.
Mswati and Sarah, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
And now for your US cannabis news. The will of the voters is being carried out just a few weeks after Election Day. In Oregon and New Jersey, prosecutors have already started suspending marijuana possession cases. A new study by the U.S. Center for Disease Control has found that the admission of teenagers for cannabis misuse fell sharply in states that legalized marijuana for rec. In fact, during the country's major legalization period of 2007 to 2017, teen admission rates for weed misuse fell by nearly half nationwide. On our last episode, you may remember I talked to Andrew D'Angelo of the Last Prisoner Project about their work to free the prisoners of the war on drugs. And they were working to free Richard DeLisi, the longest-serving cannabis offender in the US. And by golly, they did it. Props to the whole team at LPP. Make sure that you read up on their work in our latest issue of Different Leaf magazine. After DeLisi, lawmakers and advocates started writing to the outgoing president, asking him to free more cannabis prisoners before he leaves office. So keep an eye out for that as well. And it looks like Rhode Island might be the next state to get cannabis legalization, because lawmakers there are finally realizing that everyone has just been driving over to Massachusetts and giving their neighboring state the tax money this whole time. Rhode Island's Senate Finance Committee is meeting at the end of this month to discuss some budget articles, and one of them is about recreational marijuana. Thanks again to my guests this week, Sarah and Mswati from the Charlestown Coalition. We've got a beautiful new issue of our cannabis journal out for you. Go to differentleaf.com and order yourself a copy or find a local retailer. Follow us on social media at differentleaf or at different_leaf. I'm at Brit the British. And thanks as always to our fabulous producer, Andrea Maraskin, and to Homebody for the music.